2026 will see the publication of William Vollmann's next novel. A Table for Fortune is supposedly a history of American military intelligence over the past 70 years or so that's rumored to clock in well north of 3,000 pages. But if you're just getting started with William Vollmann, you got a real problem on your hands. It's not just that he's so prolific. I mean, he writes faster than most people read. It's also that he creates a unique voice for every story he tells. So what I'm going to do today is go through all 10 of the William Vollmann books that I've read, just give you a brief overview. What are they about? What's the style? So you can get an idea of where you might want to start. Like a lot of people, I started with You Bright and Risen Angels, and I think a lot of people find it because they're Googling, hey, what are some other authors who sound like Thomas Pynchon? This is a maximalist novel about the history of electricity and about the resulting war between corporations and bugs. There's various people. Some of the people are very much described like they might be plants. There's a lot of things going on in here. There is a climax that happens in the middle of the novel when the narrator tells you he might not get to it, so he wants to tell you what happens to the characters. If you like that sort of maximalist writing, and if you're open to something that is comedic and absurd, this is a great place to start. But it is not necessarily the best introduction to the rest of Vollmann's catalog or indicative of where he went with the rest of his career. Another thing he's well known for is the Seven Dreams series. This is a series of books that looks at various collisions between European explorers and the tribal people living in the Americas. The first book in the series is The Ice Shirt. And this is about the Vikings coming over from Scandinavia. There's a lot of recitations of various Norse myths. It's a great history of that time. It's not necessarily the strongest one in the series, but if you're going to read the whole thing and you love Vollmann, it's a good place to start. This is where the story begins. One thing this book does do is introduce the character of William the Blind. And William the Blind is the narrator of all these novels. He is present in all of them. His voice changes pretty radically throughout them, though. Second book in the series is Fathers and Crows. Obviously, I own it, but I have not read it yet, so I got to skip it. Which brings me to Argall. Argall is a story of John Smith, Pocahontas, and the Virginia colonies. It's written in just an amazing style. Like, as a writer, this book is so much fun to read. I don't know how to explain it, so I'm just going to read a couple sentences to give you an idea for what it sounds like. I fear to compound my first offense in penning such slender and tuneless lines as these, by presuming to direct them to yourself, particularly when their subject is a mere wilderness of insignificant salvages. For what could be more worthy of our puzzling, save the Almighty himself, than the hives of godliness we call cities? And what less so than fens and frog pools? Vollmann invented a whole new style for the next book in the series, The Dying Grass, which clocks in somewhere around 1,300 pages. Now, I've done a whole video breaking this book down, so you can go watch that if you want. This is the story of the Nez Perce War, particularly the month in which General Howard pursued Chief Joseph through Oregon, through Montana, to the Canada border. And it's written in a style that I can't even read to you. Along the left-hand side of the page, the main action happens, and then in inset paragraphs, Vollmann gives us like scenes of natural beauty or interior monologues from the people involved in various discussions, or maybe snippets from other things that might be going on around camp, trying to almost create a picture for you that you can look at the foreground, the background, all the things that happen, and really start to think about who these people were and the world that they were inhabiting. I know that probably makes it sound like a difficult read, but it's not. You will pick it up really quickly, and if someone had to say, hey, which of these is the greatest literary achievement, the most innovative book, I would point to The Dying Grass. When we come to the fifth book that's been published so far in the Seven Dreams series, and that's The Rifles. The Rifles tells three different stories. The first is John Franklin and his hunt for the Northwest Passage, particularly the years in which his doomed expedition got frozen into the ice and ended up every one of them dying and disappearing forever. Woven into that story is a story of a white man who falls in love with a Canadian native. And then Vollmann's own experiences as he did research for this novel. Now, Vollmann, you probably heard of like participatory journalism, which he also does. He almost does participatory fiction, where he puts himself in the place where his character is going to be. And apparently he damn near froze to death while he was researching this book. And those three stories go in and out of each other, sometimes in the same sentence, drifting through time periods, trying to create parallels between Franklin's expedition and these two other stories. I would put this book in the lineage of like Faulkner or Virginia Woolf, one of those truly postmodern novels that tries to collapse time and asks you to consider your relationship to it. Another thing that Vollmann is famous for is telling stories about the people who live on the fringes of society, the streetwalkers, and the poor people who live in our cities, particularly in San Francisco and Sacramento. And that's what he does in his book, The Royal Family, which I am holding up backwards because the cover is incredibly inappropriate and I don't want to get this video blocked. This story is the story of two brothers, particularly one who starts the story as a private investigator, and then he kind of bottoms out as he searches for these legendary street people throughout San Francisco and Sacramento. If you read this novel, be prepared for some shocking scenes, especially in the middle where some people are exploited in pretty horrible ways, and the end, where you really follow people as they start to bottom out. Next, we got a couple volumes of short stories. Last Stories and Other Stories is billed as a book of myths. The first section of this actually happens mostly in Sarajevo, with short stories based upon Vollmann's time as a journalist there. But the rest of this book has a mythic quality. It is different stories from around the world involving ghosts and vampires and werewolves and love, love, love in every single one of them. It takes you from Japan to America to Eastern Europe to Western Europe, all over the globe, as he searches for what love is and whether it can actually endure beyond the grave and the horrible price that people sometimes pay for trying to outlive their own mortality. There is gorgeous writing in this book, especially as you get towards the end. Almost every story immediately puts you in a place just with the language involved. The only advice I have for you if you do decide to read this is you don't necessarily have to read all the stories in order, but you do have to read each section in its entirety, because each geographic area might have 3 or 4 stories devoted to it, and they're just so much richer when you read them all together, painting a real portrait of that area. And next, I've got the rainbow stories. These stories are all stories about people who are living on the outskirts of society. The back cover copy says, breathtaking stories populated by punks and angels, skinheads and religious assassins, streetwalkers and fetishists. All these stories are good. A couple standouts for me were the green dress, violet hair, and indigo engineers. And I have a little note that I wrote on that first page saying, I think green dress was my favorite story, but indigo engineers is classic Vollmann. Another good place to start with William Vollmann, I think, might be his short story collection, The Atlas, because it pulls together so many of the different things that he is famous for. It has some stories about people on the edges of society. It has a lot of travel around the globe and stories from different places. And it's also got maps, geographic coordinates, and other just details that he tends to collect in his novels that you can read to give yourself a deeper understanding. It's up to you how much you want to dive into every single detail that Vollmann provides in all of his work. Sometimes he even does illustrations for him. Which leads me to Europe Central. And I think that even though this is probably his most famous novel, it did win the National Book Award, it's kind of a hot take to say, this is where I would start with William Vollmann. For me, this is still the quintessential William Vollmann novel because it does have so many of the things that I love about him. What's it about? Well, it's about Russia and Germany and those two autocratic societies and the parallel societies that they built through the first half of the 20th century. It takes the form of short stories or scenes that bounce back and forth in time, but there are characters that flow through the different short stories and reappear, and you can watch them grow and change. So you're seeing both his insight into human nature, but also the epic scale with which he looks at the world. And you're also seeing a range of writing styles. There are a couple scenes in here which are pretty absurdist, if that's what's called for to tell the story. There's a lot that are just achingly sad, and some that feel more like journalism. So I think that most Vollmann fans would talk about Seven Dreams series, Bright and Risen Angels, some of those books. For me, Europe Central still is the easiest one to hand to someone and say, hey, if you like this, you're probably going to like the rest of his books. While you're looking into books by Vollmann, if you like the video, check out my short story Goulash. I tell people Goulash is basically Blade Runner in a cornfield. The back cover copy says, an artificial intelligence is found dead, drowned in an idyllic stream. And when none of the applicable algorithms can calculate a likely cause, a human clone is tasked with the investigation. So this is a mystery, but it is a very literary mystery. It has a very soft ending. It is mostly about the search for self. So if you like the video and want to help me out, this is on both Kindle and in paperback. The paperback has some illustrations that I did myself too, so check it out.